to talk about some string methods that describe the characteristics of a string by returning either true or false. So these string methods are known as methods that are tests, right? So these methods return logical values of either true or false, depending on what the string contains. And what we usually do is we call these methods within the conditions of the if statement or within the test blank in a loop. So within a for loop, it'd be the second blank, and within the while loop, it would be the only condition blank. So an example of where we can use this is in this if statement here. So we're using a specific method called starts with. And this is a string method, right? So we're going to be using the dot notation to call this method, right? There's many strings out there, but we want to specifically talk about the name string. And so we want to see if the name string starts with doctor. So in this case, we do if name dot starts with quote doctor quote, then we print the line med school or PhD, because you don't know if the doctor went to med school or if they actually have a PhD, right? Otherwise, else if name dot ends with Esquire, and as you can probably guess, this checks if the string name ends with ESQ dot, then it basically makes some remark relating to lawyers, right? So based on certain characteristics of the string, you can run if statements or even loops. So here's a few examples of some string test methods that you might want to use. There's actually more than this, so it's good to look it up online, but the most important ones would be equals ignore case, starts with, ends with, and contains. And so these methods all return something, right? So methods can now return types, and the type that they return is a boolean. So all of these will be returning either true or false. Now, we just learned boolean, and they're basically another data type, right? So it's just like if it's an int or a double or a string, except this time they're going to be returning just either true or false. And whether it returns true or false is exactly what conditions need in an if statement, or what the test blank needs in a for loop or while loop. Okay, so for instance, in our method here, we have equals ignore case, starts with, ends with, contains, right? And so we all have to access them through the dot notation. We have to type in the variable name of a string object, dot equals or dot equals ignore case or dot starts with, and then we pass in a parameter to this method. It's another string, but this string is basically checking. It's just the input that this method needs. I think it's pretty straightforward what it's asking for, right? So for instance, if you do name.contains prof, this just means does name contain prof. You can think of the name as the haystack and the prof as the needle, right? So you're trying to find the needle in the haystack. And so this method will either return true or false, and that'll determine the execution of the program. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that we use a dot equals method rather than using the double equal signs to compare strings, because strings are object variables, and they're not really primitives. Primitives are integers, or doubles, or booleans even. And so it's pretty unambiguous what they are. They're just very simple data types. But strings are not like that. Strings are objects. So every string you make is going to be a separate object from each other, because you do, well, never mind. You wouldn't do it for a string specifically, but for objects, you might make a new one by doing new class name and then parentheses. For strings, we have a special notation of using just the quotes, and that does create its own object, but it's important to note that it's basically saying like new string, whatever. Anyway, this means that no two strings that are created by them, like created separately, are actually the same string, even if they contain the same content. So when you do a double equals, you're really comparing whether the two objects are the same, not whether the two objects contain the same content. And so when we're checking for content equality, we really have to use dot equals. So it's really, really bad. It's a really bad idea to use double equals to compare strings unless you are trying to compare two objects for a specific purpose. And I don't think we will ever do that in this class, but what you will be doing is checking if two string objects, which are different objects, will contain the same content. And in that case, you will want to use either dot equals in most cases or equals ignored case if the case does not matter, right? And so using these methods are going to be basically a replacement to like the equals equals or the greater than equal or less than equals. It's basically like those operators for integers, but now for strings. These are the equivalents. So here's a question for you. How can we make a program to prompt these two words and then report whether they both rhyme or alliterate? It could be one, the other, none, or both, right? So our definition of rhyme is that they end with the same last two letters, and the definition for alliterate is that they begin with the same letter. So we can just basically use some of our straight test methods to do this. So let's go look at this, right? So as you can see here, what we do is we use a combination of string methods that return integers, and then we just use our operators to check for if a condition is true. And these operators basically return, they're basically tests, so they return either true or false. And we can use our logical operators to do compound checking, right? So in this case, as you can see, checking if the word ends with something, and we use a substring method to check for this, right? So as you can see, you can pass the return values of string methods into the parameters of other string methods. And you can do this for actually any method call for any part of Java, right? So in this case, what we're doing is check whether they end with the same two letters, right? If they check with the end with the same two letters, we first need to make sure that the length is greater than or equal to 2, because otherwise they can't end with two letters, they probably end with 1 or 0. Next thing is, we check if word 1 ends with the substring of word 2, starting from length minus 2 all the way to the end. So let's start evaluating what this means from inside to out. The first thing is word2.length, which is the length of our word2 variable. I can't highlight just this, sorry about that. And we subtract 2 from that. So we go back to the second to last character in word 2, right? And so that's the index of the second to last character. Then we look for the substring of that word 2. And so we want to take it from the second to last character all the way to the last character. And so this is how we input that in. We ask for the substring from the second to last character, and then we don't need to put in the second parameter, because if the substring method takes in just one parameter, that means we want to go from this index all the way to the end of the word. And finally, we just check if word 1 actually ends with this. And I think what's important to note here is you could probably do the same. You could probably switch word 1 and word 2 in these cases. So this could be word 2, then this could be word 1, this could be word 1, and do the same thing. Whoops. And then for our check for alliteration, we just get the first two characters of word 2 by using the substring, and this doesn't return a boolean; it returns a string. But we just pass it right on into starts with parameter, and starts with checks whether word 1 indeed starts with this, and if they do, then you just say they alliterate. And starts with returns true or false, so we can just put it right into the condition of our if statement. So These are basically some ways that you can use string test methods to determine whether something meets the conditions, meets these characteristics or not of the string, and then you can basically use this to conduct some actions in your code, which you need this information for.